Why does it feel like the same idiots are in charge, no matter who you vote for? How come we seem to get the same policies after every election, despite the different promises made before each election? This is because your country isn't simply run by those you vote for. In fact, in many ways, it's run by people you never get the chance to elect, or even hear about. Public policy is often decided by permanent officials out of sight from the public. Now, in theory, of course, officials in the State Department or the Education Department or at the various central banks are there to do what those you elect tell them to do. In reality, elected politicians are often puppets, and the administrative state the puppet master. These unelected officials are what I mean when I talk about the elite. When I call them the elite, I'm not suggesting they have any great talent or ability. Unlike, say, elite athletes or an elite artist, our administrative elite aren't especially good at anything. In fact, they often get things horribly wrong. Here are 5 big things our elites have got wrong. The number one reason our elite fail is that they have a fundamentally flawed way of looking and thinking about the world. Let me elaborate. Do you ever feel that the people running the country don't really believe in it? Have you ever wondered why the elite seem embarrassed by expressions of patriotism and pride in our country? This is because they've been taught to think this way for a reason. They have what I call a postmodern mindset. Think of it as a disease or affliction of the mind. Members of the administrative class became members of the administrative elite because they generally spent a lot of time at so-called elite universities. Now, don't assume that there they acquired a lot of knowledge and wisdom or the ability to think independently and analyze complex facts. Many have instead been immersed in a form of ideology. Postmodernism. Postmodern ideology teaches our elite that there's no objective truth. Wisdom, they're indoctrinated to believe, comes not from the acquisition of knowledge, but in being non-judgmental. One way of life our elite leave university believing is of equal worth to any other. This makes them what we call cultural relativists. People from different countries and cultures, our elite think, are interchangeable. Cultural relativism is why our elite allowed 20,000 Haitians to settle in Ohio. They imagined perhaps they were allowing in future doctors and engineers, if not the next wave of Wright brothers. Patriotism itself is quietly despised by our overeducated elite, who see national identity as something entirely artificial. A 19th century construct at worst, a set of clothes to be changed out of at best. Any evidence that people from different nationalities might not be quite so interchangeable is explained away as evidence of discrimination. Virtue, our elite believe, is not defined in terms of beauty or good character or innovation, but by where one sits in a hierarchy of victimhood. This incidentally explains why Western societies, presided over by such people, have produced so little art or architecture or beauty in recent decades, but produced plenty of angst about microaggressions and privilege. Cultural relativism also accounts for some of the West's biggest foreign policy blunders. For years, those in the State Department seemed to imagine that China, Russia, Turkey and all the rest were moving in the same direction as us. Countries in the Middle East, they believed, could be remade in the image of Western liberal democracies. How wrong they were. The way the elite sees the world at home and abroad is profoundly flawed. The postmodern mindset might have impoverished the West in many ways, but materially, the West has grown richer. Much, much richer, in fact, at least for now. The trouble is that far too much of this growth has been accomplished by stimulus, that is to say, government interventions designed to raise output. This is the second major mistake our elite has made. They believe that they have discovered, in effect, a perpetual prosperity machine by printing more money. A generation ago, Western elites believed they could manage economic growth by spending more than was raised in tax revenue in downtimes, and making up for it by spending less than the tax take in the good times. They called this demand management. As we know, they ended up spending more than the tax take pretty much all the time. The US government spends about $1 trillion more than it takes in tax every 100 days. America last balanced the federal budget when Bill Clinton was in the White House. But it's worse than that. Ever since Alan Greenspan, who ran the Federal Reserve from the mid-1990s, central bankers in America and Britain have responded to any bad economic news with a different type of stimulus. Instead of merely spending too much, they tried to raise output by producing lots of cheap credit. Again, what was once supposed to be a temporary way of offsetting a slowdown became a permanent fixture. At some point, all that debt will have to be repaid, either in higher taxes or massive inflation. Or the growth created by cheap credit will evaporate. The bubble in asset prices will collapse. Much of the growth created by stimulus will prove illusory. The third big fallacy that our elite believe in is the cult of climate change. Climate change has become, for many in our elite, a sort of substitute religion. Obsessed with the doomsday idea that harmful human activity will bring about the end of the world, they demand we seek penitence. Some climate campaigners, in the manner of a millenarian sect, want a fundamental transformation of society. Like many belief systems, the cult of climate change harks back to the notion of a purer past to which a corrupted world must return. It demands sacrifice. We all need our carbon offsets. It demands restriction and restraint. Mere mortals must cut back on their air travel. The trouble is that even if man-made climate change was the problem that they claim, the remedies for solving it often make matters worse. Policies designed to reduce carbon dioxide emissions in Europe and America have reduced carbon dioxide emissions, but only by moving emission production to Asia. Europe is heading towards a kind of self-inflicted deindustrialization without impacting the Earth's climate one iota. Any serious effort to reduce our use of oil and gas to generate energy would mean a massive expansion in nuclear capacity. The fact this hasn't happened tells you there's very little rigor or intellectual coherence behind climate change policies. A lot of it is purely performative, not purposeful. Wise policymakers would have shown skepticism before adopting costly policies. They would have questioned claims about the true impact of burning hydrocarbons. They would have considered the actual impact of some of the so-called solutions. Instead, our elites have ploughed ahead with disastrous consequences for Western economic growth. There's another policy area where our elite has failed to ask the right questions before implementing ruinously expensive policies. COVID. COVID lockdowns are the fourth great catastrophic failing of our elites. We now know that the risks of dying of COVID were wildly exaggerated. Yet in order to try to prevent the spread of the COVID virus, which turned out to be about as fatal as a particular bad outbreak of flu, many societies were shut down. When did our administrative elite stop to ask if face masks made much difference? Who among our elite questioned the wisdom of shutting schools? Why did so few people in positions of power stop to ask if the consequences of lockdowns might be more harmful than the virus? During COVID, so-called experts produced endless graphs warning of disaster. Why did we ever imagine such people could forecast the trajectory of a virus, let alone change the trajectory, by telling us how far apart we should stand? Sweden, where policymakers asked rational questions and didn't implement draconian lockdowns, has had fewer excess deaths during COVID than countries such as Britain, which seem to momentarily lose their minds. This brings me on to what I think is the elite's greatest failing of all. The belief they have that they know enough to know. Elite conceit is perhaps their biggest weakness of the lot. COVID, climate change, the economy. When our elite makes policy about any of these things, they do it by so-called modelling. That's to say, they input all kinds of data into a computer model, often in reality just a spreadsheet, and from that forecast what will happen, and by extension, tell us what we need to do about it. But COVID, climate change, the economy, they're much more complicated than any model can allow for. There are almost infinite things that can influence how fast a virus spreads, or the climate, or the economy. Modelling is little more than guessing. It turns out that we give our elite free rein to make policy in really important areas on the basis of guesswork. We're invited to defer to experts who, it turns out, are as likely to be right as you or me. The elite's conceit, the belief that credentialed experts have a unique wisdom to decide what's right, has cost Western societies very dearly. Now, Western democracy has, or used to have, a secret superpower. It's not that America, Britain and the West were governed more wisely, or that officials were any cleverer than elsewhere. It's that when they got things wrong, they found it easier to change course. The accountability of those in charge forced a rethink. The West is in a mess because it's run by people today almost incapable of any kind of rethink. Specific policy failures, such as over COVID or climate change or using low interest rates to try and make everyone rich, are symptoms of something far more disturbing. Our administrative elite has a postmodern mindset that believes there's no absolute truth. Yet at the same time, their conceit allows them to claim an authority of knowledge, to know what is right with misplaced certainty. This is a toxic combination that is wrecking the West.